This is Audio Visual Lecture 2, Part 2. So we were talking about um, the terms that are used to describe various parts of the wing, the leading edge and the trailing edge and so forth. So back to this slide here. So this is looking at the side of the wing from the tip towards the fuselage. We have the leading edge on the front and the trailing edge on the back. Another way to look at it is if we're looking at the wing from the top down, so our leading edge stretches along the front of the wing, trailing edge behind. We also have the wing tip, of course, that's kind of self-explanatory, and then the part of the wing that attaches to the fuselage is what's called the wing root. Now, within those separate parts, if you think of if you just imagine a wing or a whole airplane, for instance, and you wonder what's inside of it, what actually makes up that structure, it's actually pretty hollow. So airplanes have to be very light in order to fly. To have a practical source of power, such as an engine or even if it's a glider, to be able to be towed by another airplane, they have to be pretty light in order to fly with the size of wing that they have. The larger and heavier the airplane, the more wing that it needs, and so it wouldn't make any sense to have a two-seat airplane need a wing that's 100 feet long and 25 or 30 or 40 feet across. So to make it as light as possible, that depends on the structure, both the structure and the materials that are used. So the basic structure for a traditional airplane, if you kind of think of it as like a skeleton with a rib cage, you know. So here's my artist's rendition of a spine right here with ribs around it. So just use your imagination a little bit. Now take that concept and apply it to an airplane wing. You have two main parts of it. You have a spar, and then you have ribs. They are actually called ribs. And for the analogy that we just used, the spine, or your spine, would be equivalent to the spar of an airplane wing. And the Principles of Flying text has some really good pictures that illustrate this. You have the spar, which is this long sort of 2x4 looking beam that goes through the wing, and then you have the ribs that are these right here, and they're in the shape of the wing. That's what actually provides shape and curve and so forth to the wing. Just to kind of put terms to that again, so looking from the top down, so here's our leading edge, trailing edge, wing tip, and wing root. And then you have your spar that goes lengthwise like so, or widthwise depending on the way you're looking at it. And then you have the ribs that are going across it. So you form this sort of truss-like structure right here. Now this is very basic. There may be several spars. There will certainly be several ribs. So here's a little addition on here. Here you have several spars. It just depends. But that is the basic sort of traditional structure of a wing. And a fuselage is going to be quite similar. It'll have a structural support of some kind, and then several pieces that form up a sort of a lattice work. There's another good picture on page 30, if I can get this situated here, that shows that sort of lattice work right there. Now that kind of brings us to the materials that are used to create these airplanes. In the Principles of Flying book, those pictures right there are showing predominantly wooden spars and wooden ribs, and these would be covered with fabric. Fabric that is coated with a chemical that shrinks the fabric tightly against the wooden structure, sort of like a web almost. If you think of shrink wrap or something, that conforms very tightly to that shape, to where you can kind of knock on it with your fingers a little bit and it'll sound like a drum, stretched very tightly like the face of a drum. Now within that, your spars can also be made of metal, and your ribs of course also, and the way that those are going to be to save weight, again, it can be a solid wood spar, it can be this box spar with a hole in the middle of it to save weight, or truss type, or an I-beam shape, and this here again, these are weight saving. These are weight saving things here. Now the material is going to determine how much weight you can save with it. Wood is going to have to be pretty solid because that's where it derives its strength, whereas aluminum or some kind of metal can be very light, and also not need a whole lot of support. So that truss type gives you support but cuts out a lot of material to save on weight. Again, with the ribs, you can kind of do the same thing. And even most wooden ribs have this truss type shape, because if you fill all this in with wood, that's going to be a lot of extra weight, and you're still getting the structure from this truss type right here. Most metal ribs are going to look like this. They'll have the basic shape with holes cut out of it right there. And that's not compromising, it's just that it still gives you the structure that you need while saving on some weight. Just some more really good illustrations of the terms that we've been using are found on page 22 in figures 19 and 20. You have the top down here, so you have a leading edge kind of former right there. You have a spar here, sort of a trailing edge spar, and then you have the ribs running front to back right here, kind of another cross section of it. Between those pictures and the pictures in the Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, you should be able to get a pretty decent grasp of the structure of the wing. Page 25 with figures 24 and 25 shows some good illustrations of what we were talking about earlier with flaps and just how that curves the trailing edge of the wing. We're not going to get into flaps too much more other than that for now, just because that's all that we're really covering. Pages 163 to 171 in the Principles of Flying book, I would take a look at that to sort of reinforce those terms that we were talking about earlier of pitch, roll, and yaw. It talks about, on page 163, it talks about three axes, if you will. One that goes up through the airplane, one that goes from nose to tail, and one that goes from wingtip to wingtip. And these axes are the way that the airplane moves, what we would say, about those axes. So for instance, when the airplane pitches, it's moving about this axis here from wingtip to wingtip, because it's moving like this when it pitches. The axis that goes straight up through the airplane, that z-axis, that's the yawing axis, because when it moves from side to side like a boat, it's moving about that axis. And then the roll axis is the one that goes from nose to tail like this, because the airplane rolls about that axis. So just read up on those terms in there. It describes it fairly well on page 164. It says, for instance, rotation about the x-axis is produced by the ailerons and is called roll. It's a fairly simple way to state it, but just go over that to get familiar with using those terms, just so that you're really comfortable with the pitch, roll, and yawing motion of the airplane. All right, so just to review those terms that we were going over, I've kind of put them all on one slide here, but I'll try to get the slide and not too much of my fingers in there. These are worth copying down, just because these are some key words that we've gone over today and will very probably make their way onto the quiz or an exam in the future. Um, so these are the ones that you want to be familiar with. So that roll is caused by the ailerons, the pitch caused by the elevator, the yaw caused by the rudder, um, and then those terms below it, the stabilizer, both horizontal and vertical, the leading edge, trailing edge, tip and root of the wing, the chord line, and the rib, and I'm going to add one more on there, the spar. So the spar, of course, being that structure, this spine, if you will, of the wing. Just another word about structure as far as materials. We were talking about wood and fabric earlier, and then metal a little bit. Up until the, I'd say the mid 19, actually the early 1950s, it was pretty common for airplanes to be covered with fabric. They would have a frame of either aluminum or wood and covered with fabric. And then probably starting in the early to mid, certainly by the late 1950s, most manufacturers were making entirely metal airplanes. So it would have a metal structure covered with an aluminum skin, a very, very thin aluminum skin. It'd be thicker than a soda can if you think of that, but thinner than the metal on your car. And again, that's just for weight. Aluminum is a very light metal structure that is also very strong, so that was a popular one. And instead of literally sewing the fabric to the structure of the airplane, this aluminum would be riveted to the metal structure. So we can talk about rivets in more detail, but it's just a way of almost snapping it to the metal structure. This was an improvement because fabric airplanes, even with paint and chemicals on it, do not hold up as well in the elements, nearly as well as aluminum or metal will. Now there's a third kind of material that's become very common in the last 10 or 15 years, and this is composite material. So this is basically fiberglass or a plastic material. It's a little more advanced than that, but that's kind of what it boils down to, is being a plastic or a fiberglass. And these structures tend to be all in one, rather than having ribs and spars and so forth. It may have a spar, but the composite material is molded in a mold, and it is its own structure. So if you think of a plastic mold or something, it's not solid, but it is its own. The shape is the structure, and because of that, it can be extremely light and also strong. Now, the disadvantage is that it's not been tested nearly as much over time. They've done stability testing on it, and they've loaded it up with sandbags to see how much weight it could take, and certainly very extensive flight testing. But because it's not been in production for nearly as long as other structural materials, we don't know how long it's going to last over time like we do the other structures. So that's something just that's in the nature of being a relatively new material, is finding out how it wears over time. But those are the three common structural materials now. The metal with a fabric covering, you have metal with a metal covering, and then you have composite materials. And the Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge is going to go over those composite materials a little bit more, because it is a more sort of modern structure. So I'd encourage you to look through that again. The first project is introduced this week. I will send out an email with instructions on that rather than go over it here in the lecture, just because there are some guidelines I want to lay down for it, as well as to encourage you to begin looking for a project. So look for an email introducing Project 1. Okay, well, that concludes Audio-Visual Lecture 2. If you have any questions, send me an email, and other than that, we will see you next week.